I want to thank St. John's College, one of the most beautiful colleges at Cambridge, for hosting us here this evening and making this hall available to us. I want to thank the Hewlett Foundation for giving us an extraordinary level of support that has enabled this international conference to take shape. And I want to thank the John W. Kluge Center of the Library of Congress for several reasons, for becoming a partner in this enterprise, for sponsoring a reception and canapé dinner afterwards for everyone who is in this room at the Varsity Restaurant, about a 10-minute walk from here, with 360-degree views of Cambridge from the top floor where it will be located. And I also want to thank the Kluge Center for bringing Kluge alumni, British students whom the Kluge Center has brought to the Library of Congress over the years to do research in the Library of Congress's wonderful archives. There are many such alumni in the UK. A significant representation of that group is here with us today. And so it's a special thanks to the Library of Congress, the Kluge Center, and to three individuals in particular, Kevin Butterfield, Dan Torello, and Travis Henry. Thank you very much. I'll have instructions and we have maps to get you to the Varsity Restaurant. Afterwards, there is a bottleneck. We have to get 200 people up in one lift that can hold 10 people maximum at a time. There are a lot of young people in the audience, so you may just prefer to take the stairs. Our chair for this evening's panel is Rana Foroohar, global business columnist and associate editor at the Financial Times, and CNN's global economic analyst. Rana is the author of 3 acclaimed books, Makers and Takers, Don't Be Evil, and Homecoming, which was named one of Kirkus's best nonfiction books of 2022. From 2022 to 2023, Rana led the MA Economics program at the Columbia Journalism School, where she developed a new curriculum on post-neoliberalism. A member of the Council on Foreign Relations, she serves on the board of the Open Markets Institute. And I can't say with a great degree of confidence that there's no one I'd rather having be the chair and interlocutor for this evening's session. Talked a lot with Rana over the last several years, and this is going to be a special occasion. Rana, thank you so much for doing it, and the floor is over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great. Thank you, Gary. I feel like my mother wrote that introduction, you know, and it's not just because I reviewed his book very well in the FT. I am totally honored to be here, so happy to have been in conversation with Gary for a few years now on these topics, neoliberalism and what comes next. And I'm incredibly happy to be with this panel. It feels like old home week for me because so many of the people that I have called on in my work are here on stage. So I'm just going to briefly introduce folks. We're going to talk, we've got about an hour and a half. We're going to have a discussion amongst ourselves about all the topics that we've started to hear about today. And then we're going to open it up to the floor. And I think we have mic runners. So, be thinking about your questions because you're going to have a chance to chime in. So very quickly, let me introduce, starting on my near right here, Dani Rodrik, who is a professor at Harvard. He is the Ford Foundation Professor of International Political Economy. Dani is, amongst his many accolades, I think he was really one of the first seers of the era that we are in now. And I will say that your book, The Globalization Paradox, was a huge inspiration to me, particularly on my third book. You are directing the Reimagining the Economy program and Economics for Inclusive Prosperity at Harvard, which does incredible work and is really de-siloing a lot of the conversation and bringing together some fantastic people from economics, philosophy, finance, sociology, and I just love this work. Lots of prizes, lots of accolades. Dani is really one of the great thinkers on globalization, deglobalization. To his right, we have Heather Boushey, one of my best friends in economic circles, and formerly of the Council of Economic Advisors in the Biden White House. And I have to say, Heather was one of the first calls I ever made working on any story about the post-neoliberal world and Bidenomics. But even before that, you have been so important in shaping the conversation about inequality, about how growth really works in the US. She is currently a senior researcher at the Reimagining the Economy Project at Harvard, working with Dani. And am I allowed to say where you're going next?
Not yet.
Okay, all right. She's got a big gig coming up. We won't go any further. Her book Unbound, which is fantastic, was named one of the FT's best economic books of 2019. And then finally, on the far right, we have Jayati Ghosh, who is a professor of economics at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And she previously taught for 35 years at Nehru University in New Delhi. She is a titan, really, in the era, in the world of development economics. I mean, honestly, I feel like you are the touchstone for so many of these conversations. I had the privilege, I think, to get to know you first at Joe Stiglitz's house, possibly at one of his many wonderful dinners. It's kind of like, that's like the post-neoliberal world in New York. That's where it meets, at Joe's house. You've received the John Kenneth Galbraith Award for Economics and Public Service, and so I'm delighted to have this panel here to talk about where we go beyond neoliberalism. So let me start. I'm going to, I guess, pose the same question to each of you and hope to hear your own individual take on it, and then we'll jump into some of the topics that you all care about. And Dani, I'm going to start with you because you were really early, frankly, to question neoliberal wisdom at a time when not only was it not fashionable, but it could be career suicide. And you somehow managed to make it just the opposite. Help us to go back historically, understand a little bit where we've been and where we might be going beyond neoliberalism.
I think there was two fundamental problems that proved to be the kind of death knell of neoliberalism. One is the internal contradictions, the kind of internal divisions and cleavages it created within societies, the gaps between the winners and the losers and the laggards. You know, in the first instance, of course, there was economic, but it developed into broader social, cultural, political divides as well. And I think it's fundamentally one of the reasons for the rise of the far right and the rise of Trump in the U.S. Secondly, there was an external contradiction that the neoliberal order of globalization, which I've called hyperglobalization to distinguish from a more limited version, which was the Bretton Woods version of globalization. That hyperglobalization model was essentially predicated on the idea that countries would end up looking more like each other. And you could sort of go into this process of deep economic integration, but in a setting where countries were essentially adopting similar practices. There was the expectation, very explicitly articulated, when China was brought into the World Trade Organization, that it would not only be an open economy, that would also become more liberal and democratic over time. And of course, that was naive at the time, I believe, but it also has quite clearly proven that the one country that actually probably benefited the most from hyperglobalization in the sense of being able to access other nations' markets and leverage world markets, actually play the whole game by very different rules in the sense of engaging in a wide range of industrial subsidies, industrial policies, managing its currency, and not only that, so that was the economic contradiction, but also that it emerged as a kind of a main geopolitical rival for the United States and Europe as well. So then all of a sudden geopolitics comes to the front again, whereas all of this was supposed to have disappeared in a world where economically everybody is reaping the gains from trade. So I think that internal and external contradictions, I think, are the main reasons why we're coming out of that era. The problem is we can't go back. So it's not just that neoliberalism was unsustainable, that we can't resuscitate it. It's also that the order that we had before, what Gary Garstel calls sort of our political order of before, if you want to call it sort of Keynesian social democratic order, that was sort of the international extension of which was the Bretton Woods system with the GATT and so forth, very thin model of globalization. That was predicated on manufacturing essentially being not only an engine of growth, but also the foundation of social cohesion and the creation of a middle class, which then in turn underpinned a social democratic order. And we cannot recreate that. There's no, manufacturing is no longer a labor-absorbing sector. And so we can talk about what the implications of that are, but I think, so that's the real thing about Beyond Neoliberalism is really not only beyond neoliberalism, but it's also beyond the Keynesian social democratic compact as well.
That's an awesome overview, and we're going to dive into many of the things that you talked about in more detail. Heather, I'm going to ask you the same question, and I wonder if you can also bring your lens as somebody that was so crucial to crafting Bidenomics, which I was a huge fan of, and which I think kind of presented at least the bones of a kind of post-neoliberal order.
Well, we certainly tried. I want to start by noting, so first of all, I actually just wanted to say thank you to the conveners, to Gary, to Hannah, to Noam. It was an incredible day already, and really so wonderful to see all these folks here to have this, what I think is such an important conversation, particularly at this moment. I was in the Biden administration from day one until the almost bitter end. I didn't make it till quite the last day, but it was the day before the last day. They didn't let us, anyway. And I think it's important to both understand how we got here, what we did, and where we need to go next. So I think this is the most important conversation we could be having. Certainly what we tried to do, what the president tried to do, was to acknowledge that when Joe Biden took office in January of 2021, it was clear that there were a lot of things that were broken. And you just outlined, Dani, the internal and the external contradictions, the things that were happening around us. Of course, the pandemic and the supply chain crisis really brought to the fore some of those in a very visceral way for Americans. And some of the things that a lot of people, maybe people in this room, had been talking about for a long time around the fragility of supply chains, around the challenges of climate change, it gave us an opportunity to say, hey, how can we pivot and fix this? And because of the learning from the global financial crisis, there was also a lot of appetite, at least among Democrats, to say, go big or go home. We aren't going to have a lot of bites at the apple to actually do policy. So when we do, we need to go at it with everything we've got. And so that created this opportunity across the party. There was both a bipartisan sense that everything was wrong, that there was a lot of broken things, and a sense among Democrats that we really needed to do our best job at trying to fix it. And the set of solutions really did start from a couple of new points. So one is that you had a president that got up each and every day thinking about how are we going to grow America's middle class? And politicians say a lot of things, but that really was his North Star. And it was actually made it very easy for me to do my job, because that's actually my North Star as well. And I'm sorry, I'm an American, so let me explain what I mean by middle class. But what I mean there is that people get up and they're able to get jobs that afford them economic security, and that is available to broadly anybody that wants it, right? That you really are creating this opportunity and economic security for a broad middle, and that you're not having too many people at the top, and there's opportunity for folks to not live in poverty. That was his North Star, and he was really focused on how it is that we create jobs that give people that economic security, but it wasn't about starting at that endpoint. It was saying, well, what kind of economy is going to deliver that? And how can we connect that to the challenges in front of us? So the set of policies that we came up with that were implemented both through new legislation and through the state, all of the different regulations, really focused on that outcome of good jobs, but what we needed to do. And that was investing in America, all across America, making sure that we were shaping markets to be fair and competitive, both domestically through antitrust and market structure domestically, and through how we thought about international trade, so that fairness, and then always with attention to empowering workers and educating workers and their families, and making sure that you had those three components. Now, that is a different way of thinking about your economic policy than what came before. I read this book a number of years ago by this sociologist Stephanie Mudge, who labeled the economists that I had grown up and most of my career sort of watching do economic policy as transnational finance economists. And she named them that because she made this articulation in this very big book called Leftism Reinvented or something. Maybe I'm mangling the name, Stephanie Mudge. But it was because those folks got up every day thinking about how we could make sure that markets were working rather than the things that markets are supposed to deliver, which is that economic security, that economic opportunity. And I think that, for me, was the really big pivot. We had a goal. And the goal was the change we wanted to see in the world. And then economics is just a tool to help us get there. But really sort of keeping that front and center. I mean, I can spend hours talking to you about the wins, but let me just give you a couple of metrics of success. So one is that, and I'm going to just contradict Dani just a little bit. We saw, and I think I still certainly see, the biggest challenges of our time is how do we move to a clean energy economy? And that isn't one thing, it's not a little thing, it's not going to be solved just by one policy. That is a transformation in how we power our lives. It's everything around us, how we heat this building, how we got here, how we transport ourselves, all these different things. And as you think about what you need to do that, we wanted to crowd in private capital to those industries. We saw a more than doubling of investment in the construction of new manufacturing facilities around the country. That is not the only part of the economy that matters. Services are very, very important. But recognizing that if we want to transition to clean energy, we need to build things differently and we need to build new things. That was a historic accomplishment. We haven't seen anything like that since going back to the 1970s. And I will note that the prior administration, Trump 1, they also said they were going to increase investment in manufacturing. They were going to do it by just tariffs. You saw no increase in that metric over those 4 years. And we saw a doubling through an investment strategy, empowering worker strategy, and a shaping markets to be fair and competitive strategy. So a little bit of tariffs, but really heavy on the crowding in. The second thing is that those investments happened all across the country. So I've spent a lot of my career thinking and working on inequality and the political and economic implications of that, how that stymies growth, all of these challenges. If you want to do something about inequality in the United States, you need to invest in a lot of places that don't vote Democratic. And that's exactly what we did. 80% of those private sector investments were crowded in to places that didn't vote for Joe Biden in 2020 or in 2024. And I stand by that because if you want to deal with inequality, you have to focus on communities that need it the most. And I'm sure we will talk, and I'm sure people have questions like, why was this not connected to a political outcome? You have to start with some of those facts on the ground.
I love that you're bringing up all these points, and I want to just, say place matters. This is something Dani has talked about. Everybody, I think, on this panel agrees with, and we're definitely going to get into that process of now connecting the economic strategy to a political strategy. By the way, before I move on to Jayati, I want to just challenge everybody. We need a new word for both, the post-neoliberal era. I guess we need a new word for, what's post-neoliberalism? I mean, neoliberalism is a mouthful, but in the political sphere, and in particularly in the 3-minute TV world that I live in, post-neoliberalism, tough to message politically. So anybody that has great ideas, email them to me, and we're gonna rebrand, or at least I'm gonna get an 860-word column out of it. Okay. Jayati, I want to come to you and have you put this in a global context. And I kind of feel for you because I feel like I've been on so many panels where someone turns to you and says, and what does the global South think? And that's kind of like, a difficult and ridiculous question to try and answer. But we had a conversation yesterday, and you made the point that this conversation that we're having in the West that's a bit new and fashionable is not so new and fashionable. So maybe take it from that standpoint.
Well, okay, to begin with, yes, you're right. I mean, industrial policy, planning, the whole process of development, coordination problems, these are things that have been debated in the developing world from the 1950s. And, really intense and serious and sophisticated debates about all of this. So yes, a lot of these things are kind of there. But it is also true that the developing world was also completely caught up in neoliberalism. So there is a whole generation that has not experienced any of that at all. So it's just because I'm very old that I know about it, but you know, most of my students have not been exposed to all of that. They've been exposed to the world where supposedly markets solve everything for you, etc. But I want to sort of add some footnotes to what Dani said, because I think that the other things that globalization did, I mean, the massive increase in inequality, which Heather talked about internally, but it actually was also a massive increase in global inequality at many different levels and dimensions. So if you leave China and East Asia out, because they are really outliers, if you leave them out, there's no convergence globally, you know, in terms of per capita incomes at all. But also within countries, you're getting the rural and urban divides growing massively. You're getting the class divides, the workers and capital growing massively. But within capital, you're getting a divide between multinational capital, domestic capital, multinational growing massively at the expense of domestic, and between large capital and smaller capital. So you're getting all of these different kinds of inequalities that were dramatically enabled by the state. And I say by the state, not by the process of globalization, because I think we have to keep reminding ourselves globalization is something that happened because of state policies. It's not, it wasn't, you know, God came and brought it. It wasn't the tsunami that kind of just overtook all of us. It was a decision, a political decision, a political economy decision made by a whole bunch of states and then kind of enforced on others through various kinds of international architecture. And a large part of that was also financial. So, you know, today we're all obsessed with trade, but the globalization of finance, I think, was also, and Dani has written so well about that, was absolutely critical in determining the much greater bargaining power of capital, because you could also control state activities. You could control fiscal policy by saying, we leave if you raise taxes or you have deficits or what have you. You could also, I mean, the kinds of fragility of material lives that people have experienced everywhere are very much the result also of the financial globalization. And I mean, yes, the trade globalization meant a lot of jobs were eroded, including in the developing world, right? No, we didn't gain manufacturing jobs other than China. And in fact, in China, manufacturing jobs have been declining for the last 20 years. So, you know, it wasn't that the jobs moved south. The jobs just disappeared through technology and so on. But financial globalization brings in that other part, which is that you're really fragile. You may have a crisis for not of your own doing. It's because, you know, macro policies have changed in the north. It's because you get a public health crisis. So for whatever reason, you are exposed and vulnerable in a way that even your governments cannot control. So I think capital market integration has been really bad news for most developing countries. And I think for people everywhere, including in the North.
That's so interesting. And actually, I'm going to use that as a stepping off point to a question I wanted to ask anyway about maybe a personal anecdote from each of you as to when the penny dropped about some of these problems and the potential solutions. And for me, Jayati, it was actually around financialization. When I wrote my first book because I came across this, what I thought was a stunning stat about how only 15%, this was I started in 2012, this is still true in 2016 when it came out, only 15% of all the capital flowing through the traditional financial space was going into productive investment. And the rest of it was part of this loop of financialization and the buying and selling of existing assets, which basically created a kind of a global cosmocratic, you know, wealth class. And that's part of what you're talking about. The other anecdote that was kind of an aha moment for me when I was working on my third book was a conversation I had with a labor leader at the time who I was talking about various trade deals and sort of how labor was brought in or not brought in to some of the discussions about how globalization played out. And he told me, this is in the US, he told me that folks from the Clinton administration had said, you know, about NAFTA and China coming into the WTO, don't worry. You know, yes, wages are going to get compressed, we're going to lose some jobs, but you're going to get a lot of cheap stuff in return. And this leader said, well, how long is that going to take? And the policymaker said 3 to 5 generations. And it was like, what? I remember checking that stat. So that, I think that these stories and these moments are very illuminating. And I want to go down the line before we jump into some of the specific topic matter and ask if you all have an example like that from your own careers that you were just about this whole paradigm. We didn't prep this, so we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see how good they are on the spot.
I mean, an interesting point in my career as an academic came. Let me give you two instances from standpoint of an academic economist, where I was confronted by this incredible gap between where I felt the world was and is moving and the prevailing narrative. One was the reception I had when I wrote a paper along with a graduate student that was reviewing the empirical literature on the effect of trade liberalization on economic growth. And this is in the early 2000s, where it was pretty much taken for granted that trade liberalization is fantastic in terms of boosting economic growth. And when we reviewed some of we actually took the leading papers that were cited in the context of as evidence for this, whether it's the World Bank, the IMF, the US Treasury, the OECD, and so forth. They all turned out to be highly problematic methodologically, and that when you sort of pick them apart, it looked like the effect was either not there or quite ambiguous and so forth. I remember giving this paper before it was published in the economics department at Harvard, presenting it to my colleagues. And so you have the usual kind of picking apart things, which is perfect. But at one point, one of my colleagues turned to me and said, "But Dani, why are you doing this?" So it was like, I was doing research, this is how evidence gets built up, and so I didn't know what to respond. But the idea was that, we know trade liberalization is this wonderful thing. Why are you making this fuss about, and this wasn't like a policy kind of, it was a research seminar. A kind of a related instance was in 1997 when I wrote this little monograph, Has Globalization Gone Too Far? And I sent it to a much more senior economist then, sort of very well known and so forth. I won't give his name, but so asking him whether he'd like to write a blurb. And he get back to me, says, this is all fine, that's probably all true. But don't you think you're giving ammunition to the barbarians?
Yeah. No.
And so the idea, and then that kept me thinking, sort of, who are the barbarians? And why are the barbarians not uniformly distributed around what the ideal policy is? And it turns out that in the mind of these economists, that all the barbarians are concentrated on one side of the issue, that you can't have exporters, multinationals, financial institutions be equally the barbarians on the other side. So there was a very kind of it just reflects the notion of how much of this prevailing narrative that we had, even as economists, as researchers, we should be sort of close to the evidence and to what our own theories are saying. There was this, sort of, thing that was hard to
I love
push.
that. I love that. Okay, Heather.
Okay, so I'm also going to do very briefly two. One was an academic who, when we were starting the Washington Center for Equitable Growth, I did a series of informational interviews. I probably called you. I called every smart economist I'd ever met that worked on these questions. And I talked to one very smart person from a very fancy school who patiently explained to me that my question of whether and how inequality affected economic growth and stability wasn't the right question, because that person, I will admit it was a he, his research was really about, how, what inequality is or what the outcomes are. And as I was listening to him on the phone, I drew a little doodle on my paper of a lamppost, because I was like, you literally are telling me the only questions that are legitimate to ask are the ones you can answer. But at the time I was at a think tank, but I serve as policymakers, people who are elected, people who need to actually answer the questions that they have, not the questions that you have answers to. And so it was sort of like one of those moments I was like, you literally you won't even ask the question. But so a number of years ago, around the same time, I had a conversation, and I'm going to try to not say who the person is, but with a former high-ranking, very important economic policy official from a Democratic administration. So a very fancy, a very fancy
We have no
person.
idea who you're talking
No,
about.
I mean, yeah. Well, I'll admit it was a he, but at that time...
That doesn't narrow down
That has nothing to do, because it was pre-Biden, so it couldn't have been Janet. But I was having this conversation with him, and we were talking about this question about whether and how inequality in all its forms affects economic growth and stability, what kind of economy we have. And I was asking this person, I was like, so you were in this really powerful role at the time when a lot of these things were happening, when globalization was happening. And, you know, as I think about becoming a policymaker and how we get capital to do things that are good for our economy, I'm struggling because capital's global. Like, what does it even mean to have an American firm? Like, you know, how do you get them on your side, right? How do you form that partnership? Because we need capital because they have the money and they create the industries to do the things. But, you know, and I kid you not, this guy, he looked at me and he was like, wow, yeah, I haven't thought about it that way. You've got a real problem in front of you. And again, I'm not going to reveal who it was, but it was a little jaw-dropping because I was like, wow, you created a problem. And here we are decades later, and it is this very, you know, if capital is bigger and more important than the nation state, how do you have a nation state? And if you want to work for democratically elected policymakers and be an economic policy advisor that can help deliver good economic outcomes for communities, but you don't have that lever, how do you think about, I mean, that's what this whole conversation is about, but it's very,
Yeah, huge, profound point. Okay, Jayati.
Yeah, so just in reaction to that, though, Heather, isn't capital so important and bigger than the nation state because the nation state lets it be?
yes, I would, yes.
So
exactly.
it's really about the politics of the nation state, right? And the fact that they're all in bed with large capital and all that kind of thing, which means public pressure has to change that. But you know, you're talking about aha moments. So my aha moment was actually a different kind. Because, you know, in India, the discussion is so much around, in fact, or at least it used to be before we have whatever government we have now, it was around the conditions of the people. So, you know, there was a farmers' movement, there were terrible conditions of livelihood, et cetera, et cetera. There were lots of workers' strikes, real wages were in terrible shape. And I go to an international conference and everyone's saying, oh, India's doing so well, aren't you delighted? And I said, oh, really, why is India doing so well? Well, you know, your GDP is growing at da-da-da, and your stock market, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
You're getting all this portfolio investment. So all these financial flows, which were all extremely fragile, short-term, hot money, we were adding to our reserves by borrowing these very short-term flows. And we had a high GDP growth, which was, by that time, 25% of it was finance, insurance, real estate, okay? And this was the success story. We were the big success story of globalization. Now, 15 years later, real wages, median real wages have stagnated, okay? Agriculture is still in crisis. We have some of the worst nutrition indicators in the world. You know, some of our states are in the bottom 5 of, you know, below most of sub-Saharan Africa and everything. And yet we're still seen as this global success story. Everywhere I go, people are saying, oh, you're all right, India's doing really well.
Yeah, yeah. I guess the economist said so.
Can I just add another kind of related to what Jayati is talking about. Think about the term emerging market. Right? So this actually became not part of a just informal conversation. It became an official term to this day in the IMF publications, in the IMF country categorizations. A group of countries, largely essentially middle-income countries, they're called emerging markets. I mean, so what does that mean? I mean, you're just looking at these countries purely from the perspective as investment opportunities, and of course, not real investment either, investment in financial assets.
In fact, they were set up that way, right? The IFC, the private lending arm of the World Bank, had a special thing where they inaugurated this term of emerging markets, saying these are the countries that are now able to enter global capital markets.
Yeah, it's such a great point. So let me take you all a little bit deeper into some of the kind of topic matter that the scaffolding surrounds that we've been talking about. Dani, you made a really interesting point in your opening comments about manufacturing and jobs and industrial strategy and sort of what a new good job economy might look like. So if we go back, a lot of the narrative, certainly the political narrative and some of the economic narrative in the US, but also in parts of Europe, has been that, look, we had the China shock. Technology was a part of that too. Certain areas were hollowed out. We have to figure out, and Heather's team did a pretty good job at putting some money into some of those areas and trying to revitalize them. But we know there are changes coming down the pike. As a business correspondent, I'm just amazed now when I go into factories at how much is automated. AI is coming for even more jobs. I grew up in a manufacturing family. My dad ran factories. It's just night and day. So given that pathway is gone now, how should we think about a good job economy and an industrial strategy that supports that? I know there's probably not one model, but maybe you can just start riffing on that.
I mean, to me, this is really the crux of the matter. If we're thinking about how we're going to create a cohesive, inclusive, prosperous economy of the future that also generates good politics, I think the heart of it is exactly what Heather said, is just sort of restoring the middle class, and restoring the middle class requires creating good jobs. That sort of jobs that provide a path towards a middle class existence and with dignified lives. I think this is probably the biggest blind spot in economics is that we underestimate the importance of jobs. In fact, jobs are a source of disutility. When you look at how economists go about doing their business, work is a negative thing because consumers are supposed to value, leisure, not work. But of course, now even economists are realizing, because they actually do much more empirical work than they do, when you actually talk to people, and there's some very interesting economics research on this, time and again, what comes out is the importance of the work that you do. Is it what you're doing to contribute to society, what Michael Sandel calls the notion of contributive justice, as opposed to distributive justice. Not the question of how much are we giving different people, but the question is how much are we allowing different people to contribute to society through their work. So that's really the crux. Now, in the early post-war years of prosperity and social cohesion, what I call the sort of Keynesian social democratic compact, the New Deal in the US and so forth, we had this lucky confluence, lucky coincidence that the most productive parts of the economy, the most productively dynamic part of the economy was also the job-creating part of the economy. That was manufacturing. That was the source of the industrial middle class, together with unionism and giving workers collective bargaining and a voice, meant that those productivity gains in turn were shared by workers, and you got that middle class society. Now, in some sense, both the right and the left is trying to return to that, right? Because we want to, get back to manufacturing. But for reasons you've just stated, and it's, technology, automation is part of it, the organizational structure of industry today in terms of global supply chains, even in a sort of more closed economy, this nature of globalization and global competition means that the jobs of the future are not in manufacturing. Today, in the United States, the share of employment in manufacturing is about 8.1%. Then despite all the investment that took place in manufacturing, it actually fell during the Biden administration from 8.5% to 8.1%. So, and you might say, well, maybe if we really get some reshoring back and bring supply chains back home, jobs might come. But even if we're as successful as China, right? If this is our poll start that we want to be as globally competitive in manufacturing, or at least important segments as China, you go back, as Jayati said, in the last 10, 15 years, China has lost as many workers in manufacturing as exist in the United States and Germany in total. So,
and they're losing to robots, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's not, the jobs are not going to even lower income countries. Yeah. So manufacturing is important for a lot of reasons, for innovation, for the green transition, for resilience, for national security. So I'm not arguing against manufacturing for any of those reasons. But if you go back to the central conundrum of how are we going to create a middle-class society, how we're going to create good jobs, we have no choice but to sort of redirect our energies and our focus to how are we going to make services good jobs.
Okay. Jayati, and then I want to bring in Heather. So Heather, I want to let me just bring in Heather really quickly, and then Jayati, I want to hear what you have to say. Heather, you have thought about care jobs, service jobs for a long time, and so I'd love for you to kind of build on that and layer in what you learned during the administration. And I also want to add another beat to this, and just put it out there for you to think about. I feel that there's another aspect coming, which is the intellectual property and the economy of ideas. And I was really struck, for example, by the Hollywood strikes. What was it last year? Because essentially, these were about all the value is going to live in ideas, in IP. What can AI do? As a worker, am I going to have any control over what AI can do? I now see that as a big economic issue, but I also notice, and maybe I'm being paranoid, but I don't think so, that Donald Trump is trying to stoke a little bit of MAGA in Hollywood now, talking about we'll see his tariffs are now illegal, but talking about tariffs on the movie business. Yeah. To me, that was about, not so much about the economics, but it was about taking another group of potentially fragile white-collar workers and saying, look, here's a problem, and I'm the solution. So I know I'm putting a lot out there to you.
While also investing in AI, so.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yes, exactly.
Okay, so that's a big question. I think that there's a few things. So care, AI, and I want to talk a little bit about the job thing in general. So one of the themes that I thought a lot about over the past 4 years, and I'm really sort of focused on now, is like under this rubric of what we make and how we make it matters.
Yeah.
And I think Dani has hit on something so profoundly and deeply important that it is worth making at the core of whatever this post-neoliberalism thing we are building is, which is that how people spend their time, what they are doing of value matters. That as humans, like the idea that somehow the robots are going to do everything and we're just going to take naps that doesn't gel, and it's also inconsistent with the last 100 years of history where we've had more technology, but people then do more idea where we find other things to do, and so it does seem like there's this really deep and fundamental challenge. You've got the jobs that you're trying to create that give people value and meaning and dignity and all of that. You've got these technological changes that are reshaping jobs probably faster than we can possibly imagine. And you've got this concentration of the ownership of our data, which, I'm going to go out on a limb that almost everybody in this room is an idea creator, right? We write for a living. And the idea that these machines are taking our words and the work that we are producing, and then you can go into ChatGPT or one of these and you can make it create op-eds in your own voice, is both kind of cool and super annoying because nobody's paying me for that.
By the way, I asked ChatGPT recently to give me an analysis of Rana Foroohar and how she thinks, and I said, do the most optimistic and the most critical, and it was scary.
Yeah, and they haven't paid for any of it.
Yeah.
Right? And so who owns this work? How, to me, the really deep challenge in how we're going to create those good jobs is about, well, how are we going to be able to have money to trade with each other for the things that we've had? That's really what the economy is, right? You're doing something, I'm doing something, we're all trading, right? But we spend a lot of time talking about the good jobs out here and not enough time talking about the ownership, the market structure questions, the market concentration. I know there's a number of people in the room that think really deeply about that. And that gets us, I think, to the care economy. What is the care economy? That is people doing something with their life and wanting to pay somebody else or needing to pay somebody else to care for their loved one, childcare, caring for the aged, caring for the sick, right? And these have long been jobs that have been devalued because they've been, they were things that women did for free in the home. They still do for free in the home. And it's very difficult to have a market alongside an altruistic way of providing a service. And I think that, we worked really hard in the Biden administration to create good jobs out of those care jobs. And that stuff all got, thrown on the cutting room floor as a part of the negotiations that led to the Inflation Reduction Act. We did get a lot of things done through the American Rescue Plan, so there's a lot we can learn, particularly about how you can create better jobs in those sectors. But fundamentally, that is always going to be about subsidies.
Yeah.
Because families typically, unless you're wealthy, can never afford the true cost of that labor.
Yeah.
And that's different than manufacturing or some of these other services. And so I think that we have this opportunity to step back and ask ourselves these really big questions. And at this moment, we're just the other kind of job that we need to add to our list that's coming down the pipeline, which in RDC is we're going to need a lot of construction workers. Every one of those climate disasters that is happening now with greater abundance, all of those need construction workers to pick up the messes, to build the new things. Robots can't really do that very well. And we're going to need a lot of people to build out these new clean energy systems, right? We need to be spending $4 to $6 trillion annually. We're spending just like a drop in the bucket, and that all needs to be built. So I take very seriously the point that manufacturing isn't the end-all be-all, and it may not create all the jobs, but we are in a moment where we actually do need to build a lot of things if we want to maintain the lifestyles that we have. If not, this is not all going to work.
I want to also, before we move on, I want to give you a little bit of a shout out. I thought that what the Biden administration did in terms of dot connecting, where, okay, if you're going to get federal money to build a chip factory, or if you're going to get money for infrastructure, then you have to come up with a child care plan. Then you have to come up with a training plan. It's low-hanging fruit.
It's also
to connect what you all are talking about.
Yeah, it's not only low-hanging fruit. What kills me about this, I mean, that one, so we got so much flack about this. And on the other hand, you had all these people saying, well, industrial policy, it's just boondoggles. And, you're giving all these giveaways to businesses. It's like, we put conditions on them, but you're not, anyway, so.
But it's to the state, to your point, Jayati, it's about what the state is doing and the state taking back power.
Yeah.
Jump in on all this.
Yeah, no, I'm so glad you said everything you said about care, because that was what I was going to say. I mean, to me, the jobs of the future are in care and creative industries. That's really where most employment will be. And I completely agree, manufacturing is essential, and most of our countries in the developing world, we still have to do that. And that whole project is, it's still waiting to be done. So manufacturing is essential, but not for employment creation. It's not going to give us employment, and we should recognize that.
That's okay. Finish your thought, and then I want to ask you another question.
So therefore, what then? Because we all have massive employment issues, right?
Yeah.
None of us is generating enough good quality jobs, and that's really because we are underinvesting in care, hugely underinvesting in care. I mean, if you look at care workers per population, I did a quick kind of, public workers per population, because that's kind of proxy.
Yeah.
Most workers are,
yes.
I mean, some are bureaucrats and so on, but mostly they are care workers, doctors, nurses, teachers, people who clean the schools, people who do all of that stuff, right? The global average is 5 per 100. Okay, in the United States, it's 4 per 100. In Europe, it is 8 per 100. In the Scandinavian countries, it's 12 per 100.
Interesting.
In India, it's less than 2. It's 1.8 per 100.
Wow.
Okay. In Africa, it's 1 per 100.
Wow.
We are under-providing basic services.
That's a great stat.
It's disgusting, though, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So we are massively under-providing care.
Yeah.
So we're under-investing in it. We're under-providing it. We are underpaying the care workers.
Yeah.
And precisely because, as you see, so much of it gets done at home for free. And it's not, we used to call this gender-blind policies. They are not gender-blind. They're gender-exploitative. They know that this work is going to get done anyway, because you're not going to leave your aged mother out on the street because there isn't a place to look after her, right?
Definitely not going to leave your Turkish grandmother out on the street.
So in a way, basically one of the big things we have to do is massive public investment in care, because this is not something the market will provide. Yeah. And it can be some of it through subsidies, through childcare grants that allow you to hire, etc. But they have to be big childcare grants. But a lot of it has to be public provision, because you do need to have that public alternative available to set some standards.
It is such a good point. Let me stay with you for a minute just on care and creative. So on the creative side and on the digital side, I'm curious, the conversation that I've mostly been involved with has been US-based or European-based when it comes to AI and tech. India has a very robust digital economy. What are the learnings, the takeaways, the potential solutions that you see coming from India, from other countries in the global south, around how you share the pie differently? in the creative space,
again,
in the
so
digital
this is
space?
another one where I have such a complicated view, which is very different from the global perception of India being this fabulous. Okay, yes, we have, for example, a digital payments interface, which is fantastic. Yeah. Every vegetable seller, everybody uses their phone to pay now, and that's fantastic because it's across all the systems. It's a much better system than either England or the US or anywhere. On the other hand, we have also a unique identity, a biometric unique identity, which has turned out to be a combination of extremely exclusionary because it's based on iris and fingerprints, which change for manual workers, which means a large number of people who are manual workers on public employment schemes are not getting paid because the fingerprint doesn't match. Okay, and I'm talking about like tens of millions of people are not getting paid for that. People are being denied their food rations. All kinds of terrible things. Exclusion is happening. And at the same time, it enables surveillance of a kind that is very close to China. We are now a kind of similarly surveillance society as China, which is, to me, not a good thing.
Right.
Okay? Without all the other benefits of high growth and higher per capita income and higher wages and better living conditions and safety of our workers, etc. So we've got the authoritarianism without the material conditions.
The good bits, yeah.
So I'm very conflicted about this. And everyone sees it, again, because, the Modi government has great PR. So, everybody thinks we're a massive success story of digitalization, which we are in the payments interface, definitely. We also have the highest incidence of bank fraud in the world. Seriously, it's really big, yeah? Identity theft is very common and, all kinds of bad stuff happens also. So it's not entirely a success. It's really presented as a big success. I would say that these technologies have massive potential, but they also carry threats. We don't yet have a proper data privacy law. It gives all the powers to the state. The one that's on the anvil will give all the powers to the state, none to the person. So it's a complicated situation.
It's a mixed picture. Yeah, interesting. I'm going to, in just about 5 or 10 minutes, I'm going to open it up for questions. So be preparing those. But let me throw another one or two to the group. Dani, you have said to me in the past that economics should be a friend to progressives. It feels like we've been on the sharp end of the stick for some time with that, for reasons that you've already described. Let's be optimistic for a moment. How can it be a friend at the moment? What are the policies that you see coming down the pike, or just the new economic thinking in the post-neoliberal world that we should be paying attention to?
Yeah. Well, before maybe I'll tell a little anecdote, even though it'll go against the point I want to make. So the story is
even better. We like narrative
I
tension.
actually heard in a very long time ago from E.F. Schumacher. How many people know Schumacher? Yeah. So it's a story that I heard from him. So a physician, an architect, and an economist are traveling on a long train ride. And they get bored and they get into this argument about which one of their professions is the oldest one, is the most honorable one. And the physician said, of course, look, it's medicine. Before there was any humanity, God created, Eve out of Adam's rib. That was an act of surgery. And the architect says, well, before there was Adam and Eve, God had to create the whole universe out of chaos. That was an act of architecture for sure. And the economist turns to his colleagues and say, where do you think chaos came from? So I don't want economists to be in a position where they are sort of thinking about what the new paradigm is going to be. I think that's a joint responsibility of all of us. I don't think economists, professional economists with their training are in any kind of a better position than other social scientists, other public intellectuals, or the public at large in terms of thinking about But I think they're good about certain things, and I think what they're good at in particular is empirical analysis. I think one of the good things that has happened in the economics discipline is that it has become more and more empirical over time. So if you look at the journals, the ratio of pure applied theory or pure theory versus empirical work, the ratio of empirical work has increased significantly. Now that's very important because when you're actually doing serious empirical work, your theoretical predilections go only so far. And a lot of the explosion that we've had in labor economics, for example, that it turns out that minimum wages maybe are not, if they're as long as they are, not too high, that they may not be, discouraging employment. Or in the area of trade, look at what the effect of the China trade shock has been. There's been huge employment and wage effects in various parts. So when people become in economic development, we've had this explosion of various type of experiments that not only generate, results. Do cash transfers work or not? Does microcredit work or not? Does, allocating property, title, land rights, does it work or not? But it also opens up our imagination to different types of policies. It's an experimentation in a different kind of a sense, moving away from sort of the Washington consensus model of thinking where there's, these 10, 15 things that every country needs to do. Instead, this school of empirical applied experimental work has really opened up our minds in terms of, the different types of things to try. And because of their results, we also know that what works somewhere doesn't necessarily work somewhere else. So we become much more careful about in that. So that's, I think, the advantage. And honestly, I don't think what I've told you about, the sort of what my experience, I don't think would happen today because I don't think the younger generation of economists are so ideologically committed to various types of policies. And I know you mentioned the Economics for Inclusive Prosperity. That's a network of mostly American economists, but not so. I mean, it's the work that they do, ranging from the climate transition to labor markets to industrial organization to issues of the political economy of sort of electoral districting. I think it's really it's a kind of an important input, can contribute to a progressive agenda. But don't ask an economist to design your paradigm for you.
Well, or at least tell them they have to come out of the ivory tower and experiment if they're going to do it. Heather, I want to bring you in on this, and actually, I want to make sure that you have a chance to speak a little bit about climate policy and what happened in the Biden White House. I mean, I'm struck actually by what Dani's saying and how it relates to something that you told me. I did a big cover story on Bidenomics for the Washington Monthly, and you made a fascinating point, because I asked you, I said, how did you guys start thinking about climate policy and how you were going to approach it? And it was controversial. There were mixed reviews, but you said you felt that really, particularly in the US context, that vested interests were going to be able to game a lot of very market-specific devices, and that we needed to think about climate as like a war that we were fighting and bringing all the resources to it. And I mean, it was fascinating to me because it's the opposite of anything I've heard from a US policymaker around an issue like that. So talk a little bit about what you guys did, what you think worked, what didn't work, and where we're going really on climate at this point.
Yeah, and I might be able to connect it a little bit to Dani's point about, or to this conversation about where the role of economics. I mean, classically, the solution from economists that has sort of really been the grounding of so much of our policy around climate has been, well, let's tax the thing that is bad. We want to tax carbon. It's a bad thing. These carbon emissions are really bad. It's warming the planet. We'll tax that, and then markets will work their magic, and then we will have new clean alternatives, and that'll be just amazing. And I think there was both a recognition that even where that has worked in other countries, where that kind of policy has been put in place, it hasn't been at scale to really, we haven't solved the problem. So it's not like this has been a really effective solution. And certainly we weren't getting there in the United States when the Waxman-Markey bill failed to even come up in the Senate after it passed the House in 2009. I think there was wait, okay, how are we going to do this better? And then you combine it with the China shock research, and I think a lot of American policymakers were like, so let's see, the China shock was a trade shock and we lost about 2 million jobs, and we have more people in the United States working in fossil fuel related industries than were affected by the China shock, and they're all geographically concentrated. That's probably not going to work out super awesome if we just start taxing it, right? I mean, there are real consequences. And then, of course, the other thing is that, and I often now just very much think about this in terms of my mom. My mom is like, she's not quite 80 yet, but asking her to just like transition to clean energy on her own, that markets are going to do this, I just start thinking about all the things. It's like, how is she going to do that? She can't buy an electric vehicle at this point because there's not enough charging stations. I would worry about her, something happening to her, right? If there was no gas stations, you would worry about her driving. If there's no charging stations, you would worry about her driving. And how is she going to think about, being the first mover in some of these new technologies? Like, how are you expecting people to make this transition? This is a really kind of crazy policy that's grounded on just taxing the bad. And then here's the thing, and it was said earlier in the industrial policy event conversation earlier today. This is about systems change. Everything in energy, it's about how we are powering this building, how the electricity that's going into these lights is manufactured and created. It's about, again, our transportation systems, about our agricultural systems. These are all systems, and it isn't one, it's like a gazillion different systems. We invested in 38 different clean energy technologies, and we only in the media talk about like 2 or 3. I usually just talk about EVs because I understand what a car is. I don't quite understand the battery part, but I'm getting there, right? And we maybe talk about nuclear or wind turbines, but we don't talk about like all of the other ones because they're not socialized, right? We don't know as much about geothermal or all these other different things. But when you step back and you realize that for us to actually address climate change, you need whole new systems that require whole new industries. And as a policymaker, what you are struggling to sit back, and I had this on my whiteboard in my office probably when you came in, big red letters on my whiteboard that said temporal mismatches in supply and demand. Because it was like, how are we going to solve all the temporal mismatches in supply and demand? We want people to demand EVs, but they can't demand EVs until we create the charging networks, but we can't, and then you're kind of going through, we want the EVs, but then we got to get the critical minerals, but China's got them and they're mad at us, so they're not going to export them, right? You have all of these, and then how are you going to ask these investors to invest when they don't know where the demand is coming from, not just from consumers, but up and down the supply chain? This is a planning problem. I mean, and there's a lot of people that have a lot of skills and tools in this, but that is, I think, here I'm at Cambridge, I'm staying at King's, so I'm thinking a lot about Keynes over the last few days, and it's like, you think about why we developed national income and product accounts. It was to solve a problem, to help us be able to marshal resources. Well, now we have a very different problem. And one of the things that I'm hopeful that we can get more economists to do is, how do we rethink our economic tools in light of the actual transition in front of us? Not the magical one, where and I think with economists too, we economists, we love to say, we'll just do this little tax over here and then we're out. Like, you all just deal with the consequences. And I think as a
negative externalities.
Yeah, whatever. You just tax that and then markets will magically do it. But as a policymaker and as an economist advising policymakers, you actually have to deal with all that fallout.
Yeah.
All those different challenges. And we need tools for that. We need new macro models that connect deeply to the energy transition. I think there's like thousands of dissertations, so many careers that can be built in building this all up. And I think I'm so excited about that, and I hope we can convince the best and the brightest in economics to take all of their empirical chops and their technical skills, but apply it to systems change. Yeah. Because that's what we need for this era.
Yeah, it's such an important point. It reminds me of the speech that Jake Sullivan gave when he was still in the White House about moving beyond the Washington consensus growth, quad growth, and just a new paradigm. Also, by the way, I have to just share, when I first came to see you in the White House, I noticed not your whiteboard, but that you were wearing black combat boots, and I am like, rock on. If we have like combat boots in the White House at the council, we're on the right track. Okay, Jayati, feel free to jump in, particularly on the climate aspect if you'd like, but I also want to throw one more question to you before we open it up. One of the things that often has happened to me in my career is I've been trying to kind of push against the neoliberal model and pose the idea that maybe we do need systems change. Colleagues, readers, et cetera, will bring up this idea of chaos, and of geopolitical chaos as a real oh gosh, we don't want that. We don't want great power conflict. We don't want all against all. We don't want xenophobia. And of course, we don't want these things. But is there something happening multilaterally and in a multipolar sense that is also positive here? I mean, could there be two sides?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
In fact, I was just thinking when Dani said that, there was chaos. Chaos is not always such a bad thing. I don't mean chaos of the kind where you're at war and that, etc. But you think back in history, the periods when developing countries have actually been able to break out of their position in the division of labor have been periods of global instability, have been periods when there isn't one clear global superpower. 1890s, 1920s, 30s, 1970s, 80s, and maybe now. In other words, when the rules of the game are set by the global leader, and they're pretty tough on everybody else, right? The global leader doesn't have to play by the rules, they never did, but they are rigid for everyone else, and that constrains you significantly. So you couldn't have done industrial policy because the WTO rules would have prevented you from doing that. You couldn't have done a lot of other stuff because global finance would say, no, you can't do that. Now, if there are less rules, that gives you more freedom.
Interesting.
I'm hoping, by the way, I'm hoping for financial deglobalization. Really.
Interesting.
I really want financial deglobalization. I think it would actually be very positive for the developing world. And I think it's coming because I think Trump is going to do all kinds of stuff.
Well, I was going to ask you, so are you a fan of the post-dollar world? Are you a fan of this idea of maybe dollar shouldn't be the global reserve?
Well, I mean, of course, I would like it not to be, but I don't think it's happening tomorrow. I think we are in for a period of flux. I mean, look, it took pound sterling, it took 3 decades for it to stop being the global reserve currency. But yes, we are, I think, entering a phase of definite decline in US hegemony and dollar hegemony. And I think that's a good thing for the US and the dollar, and it's definitely a good thing for the rest of the world.
Okay.
But that gives opportunities, that creates possibilities, and I think we're seeing that. We're already seeing alternatives, for example, to SWIFT. We've got BRICS Clear, which is, I think, definitely happening. We've got new exchange rate swap arrangements. China is leading it, but they're not the only ones. I mean, those dreadful Middle Eastern dictatorships are also providing exchange rate swaps. Middle powers are actually talking to each other, getting together. There are regional groupings. For taxation, there's PT-LAC in Latin America, 12 countries agreeing to cooperate on tax. The African countries are doing tremendous unity, actually. The African CDC is one of the most innovative, interesting places where they are actually bringing together knowledge because after COVID, they realized you can't trust G7 at all. So they are so they are actually doing a lot more. They were also very active in tax. They are talking about, well, you can't even call them debtor coalitions, right? Because finance gets angry. But there is a lot of movement about just exchanging information on how you deal with that, with creditors, with the IMF, with etc. So things are going on.
It's such a good point, and I love connecting to experimentation, systems change. I feel people chomping at the bit here, so I think we need to open it up. Where are our mics? We have okay, mics are over there. We've got a couple of questions. Let's see, where are the mic runners? Let's, I got to start with Bill Janeway. He's right here.
Just wait for the mic.
Oh, mics are coming, okay. And we've got a good half hour, so we'll be able to take more than a few. So right here, green, olive green.
Can you raise your hand again, whoever it was?
Dani and Heather touched on this briefly, but go back into good jobs in a services economy. How do we get there without collective bargaining? And across from Starbucks to the Amazon distribution centers, by way of all of these large scale, and revive the building trades in the construction industry?
Well, I think good jobs historically have required 2 things. One is the productivity. I think the productivity is the basis that allows for higher incomes to be earned out of doing those kinds of jobs. And then you need the voice. You need which could be labor unions, or it could be, the government playing a role using collective bargaining or other sectoral wage bargaining arrangements. So I think you need to work at both ends, because if you do only what we've seen, of course, since the 1970s in manufacturing was a very significant rise in productivity, but because unions were declined, actually median wages for males stagnated. But if you try to jack up wages through collective bargaining or mandated higher wages in the absence of productivity increases in those kinds of jobs, which mean essentially in the care sector, long-term care, for example, would be giving care workers the technology, the digital tools where they can take much better care of the people that they're looking after. So you reduce hospital costs, the cost of chronic illnesses and so forth. So we need to have those metrics of measuring productivity. But in the absence of that, simply mandating higher wages or collective bargaining may then create problems of unemployment, especially for younger people, as we have in places like Spain or France. So I think you need to work at both sides, figure out how you can sort of deploy a kind of industrial policy for services. And industrial policy, I should add, we've had a very good discussion earlier, but we associate it with manufacturing. Mm-hmm. But historically, of course, earlier, like in the United States, the land grant, colleges after the Civil War was directed at improvement of productivity and its dissemination in agriculture. And that was a kind of industrial policy, but for the agricultural sector. Now I think we're moving to the sort of post-industrial world where we'll need to reinvent those industrial policies. Let's call it something else, because it's not really necessarily just industry, but they'll have to be applied to these service activities.
Can we give a shout out to the land grant colleges too?
Yes.
Because the Big Ten got right away said, if you fight to Trump, if you fight one of us, you fight all of us. And I wish that everybody would come together on that. There was a question in pink over here.
Can I quickly disagree with
Yeah,
you?
go ahead, jump in while we're getting...
I think public spending on care is critical, because I think notions of productivity in care are useless. I mean, one nurse serving 200 patients is not more productive than one nurse.
No, that's why I think
you have
to have the right metrics, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, this idea that it's more productive, I mean, I didn't even realize that a lot of the US growth of the last decade has been in the medical industry, and with worsening health outcomes.
Yeah, isn't that weird?
Yeah.
That doesn't seem more productive.
So that's not more productive. So I think, we really have to have a different metric for what we value, and we fund it through public spending.
Well, different metrics. We could do, like, I've been to entire IMF conferences on this. We should come back to that in a future conference. Question over here.
Thank you. I think you're actually answering my question, or starting to answer my question already, which is, with these new economies, with care economies and with investment in middle-class jobs and so on, how do we measure success? What are the metrics? Because if you don't know that in advance, how you're going to measure success, it's very difficult to know how you're going to do it. I know that's a horse and cart in a sense, but it is, I think, an important... It's a
great question, and I would actually like to ask every panelist to do kind of a speed round, give a metric that we should be paying attention to that we're not. Dani.
Well, I think it depends very much on what segment of services you're looking at. But for example, in the long term, for rich countries, big sort of source of employment, the largest is long-term care. And there, the metric would have to include, for example, the cost of hospital admissions, because it's much cheaper to take care of people in their own homes than it is to have a system. Right now, especially, at least in the United States, you have a system where the people who are providing long-term care services have terrible jobs. They're paid very poorly. Very precarious jobs, and they have no agency at all, no autonomy in terms of decisions they can take with respect to the people they're caring for, which means that these elderly people are taken very badly, and then the slightest thing happens, they go to emergency rooms, and the costs of that are extremely high. So one metric in that segment would be, sort of what the cost of caring for the elderly, including the hospital costs and the cost of chronic disease and so forth. It's not like we don't have that, but organizationally the systems are not set up in such a way that necessarily we're internalizing and providing the right incentives.
Heather?
Yeah, I mean, to go macro, I mean, we live in a world that's defined by, how well our macro indicators are, GDP or other, I mean, mostly GDP, but, even national level aggregates. And I think that so much of this post-neoliberal agenda is based on something a lot more important than just that one indicator. So how do we open that up, right? That's an old conversation that I used to, if this was me 5 years ago, I would not have said that, because I kind of thought I had come to the conclusion that it was quixotic and we were never going to do anything about it. However, every sort of tragedy has a silver lining, and if you spend a lot of time and energy undercutting the US statistical agencies, then maybe as we figure out what they actually need to do next, this can be on the agenda, right? If we're going to rebuild, where do we need to go? We need to be thinking about not just going back to whatever we were doing before, but can we open up our discussion of what our national metrics of success are? It isn't just GDP, especially the way we're measuring it. It doesn't take into account home production, many of the care things. It doesn't take into account the deaths of despair that's happening across the United States. It doesn't take into account pollution and climate change. We all know this. But yet we all sit there and go, that isn't a great metric, and yet that's how we make decisions. So I would start there, and of course I was long sort of enthralled by the work that Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman and now Thomas Blanchett have doing, deconstructing that to understand what GDP looks like across the income distribution. Super important. But I think ways of unpacking, I couldn't agree with you more, but there is a moment right now to start that work, because if there is ever another political opportunity, what happens to, at least in the US context, the statistical agencies will be front and center, and this could be one of those big ideas.
Jayati?
So here's some good news. I mean, the UN is actually on it, okay? So I was part of a UN board where we suggested 5 additional measures. We can't get rid of GDP, it doesn't go away, right? Because everyone's obsessed with it. But we suggested 5 additional. One was what I call the labor market indicator, the median wage into the employment rate. And that's actually really good, because it tells you how many people are effectively out of employment. It's not the unemployment rate, it's the proportion of working age population in employment into the median wage. And for example, in the US, you find that has been kind of stagnant over the last 20 years, while per capita GDP has been growing. In India, it's been declining, while per capita GDP has been growing. So it's a useful indicator about the actual condition of working people. The second was per capita, the FAO has an indicator of the proportion of the population that can afford the FAO's nutritious diet. And it's regionally specific. So it's a different one for South Asia, a different one for North America, etc. Again, you get very different results. Our official poverty rate, with our governments having done something to the figures, is apparently less than 5% of India is poor. 74% of the population cannot afford the FAO's nutritious diet. So it tells you a different story, okay? The third we suggested was time use. And time use surveys, now 84 countries are doing it. The UN, if it gets together, it can actually do it across all countries. So time, gender differentiated, time spent on paid work, unpaid work, and your own personal and relational time. And that gives you a huge idea about the extent of unpaid work, the kinds of pressures, and which policies affect them if you actually do those time use surveys properly. The health indicator, actually life expectancy is a pretty good health indicator, because in the US it's falling, for example, right now. It is actually a pretty good proxy. And finally, the carbon emissions per capita, but per capita carbon emissions using 10 by 50. That is multiplied by the top 10% emissions versus the bottom 50% emissions. Because we all know that the top 10% in our countries, in most countries, do about half of the carbon emissions.
Okay, question here in the middle.
Hi, great panel. I had a question, which was the panel's discussed a lot about inequality, climate, jobs, but one of the biggest issues people have faced over the last 3-4 years has been inflation. Not just the inflation rate, but also price levels as well. And that's, and it's been posited that that's had a massive impact on the rise of populism and so on. So how does the panel think about that? And the second, bit of a cheeky question here, but what Trump policies do you like? Leaving aside the mode of execution, but in some ways Trump has destroyed neoliberalism more than anyone else has in recent times. So is there any policies you think like generally you agree with. The way he executes, you can disagree with, but in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Who wants to start with that? Heather, I'm looking at you.
I mean, I feel like there was something the other day that I was like, oh, that's not a bad. I mean, he did actually have a little conversation a while back about, raising taxes on rich people, and I was like, sign me up. Like, what are we doing that? That sounds fun. But that didn't go anywhere in Congress. But that would be a good one. I mean, inflation, certainly has been an issue. It was an issue around the world. It was, and there's a lot of research that's now coming out, as we knew would come out and will continue to come out on why we had it, sort of disaggregating the demand and the supply side factors. And certainly the consensus is that the majority of that was coming from the supply side. We had a global pandemic. It underscores just how challenging it is in a globally integrated economy with a lack of resiliency, which would be another indicator if I were to pick one to add to that list. We don't really understand still how resilient our supply chains are, and we are going to continue to see crises. And so that feels like, I think one of the lessons for me coming out of the inflation story is actually the chaos caused by that supply side shock had global repercussions for politics, for families, and everything in between. I mean, I will also say though that so that's on like honoring your question, super important. I will say, as somebody who spent 4 years working in the White House and answering questions about that every time I went on the news media, the framing of the economic conversation over those years, and we know because there's now a lot of work on this, has also become highly polarized. And so inflation is really important. So there's been a long cost of living crisis for American families, though, especially in the big ticket items, healthcare, childcare. And we weren't talking about that before the pandemic, and we're still not talking about it, but that's a part of that crisis. And so there's sort of that. And then it's also the fact that the media really, really wanted to paint what was happening as us heading very quickly into recession. Right? And it was very Fed-oriented. It was, are we going to have a soft landing or a hard landing? What's the Fed going to do? That wasn't about us. We were busy, all hands on deck, solving the actual supply-side crisis, which required a lot of humans picking up the phone and being like, how's your part doing today? Like, what do you need from us? How can we, we were literally solving the inflation problem in a very tactile, incredibly labor-intensive way that nobody ever saw or really heard about. The discussion in the media was largely about the Fed and the soft or hard landing. So we spent 4 years talking about whether or not the plane was going to crash, which doesn't really seem fair given the economic outcomes. So I said it really wasn't fair. And I actually am working with a colleague now who's done a bunch of analysis of news media and the framing, using, I mean, he's a data expert looking at the words, right? I'm sorry, I'm like blanking on the technical terms for all this. But one of the things that, he's sending me all these charts that it really was true that we were talking a lot more about recession even than we have been over the past few months. And that I still find rather stunning. And so the inflation, it was very important. It also was put into a context that elevated it, and the other news stories weren't really a part of it. And so, I mean, I think there was a lot going on there. Sorry,
Jayati, did you want to jump in on
Well,
inflation?
inflation is still a huge problem for about half of the world's population.
Yeah.
And that's because it's, even when global prices of food and fuel went down, they didn't go down in retail for most of the world because exchange rates had devalued, because of the capital flows and because of all the other stuff. So I think we have to remember that inflation and the absolute level of prices, so that real wages are significantly lower than they were, let's say, 5 years ago, is a huge problem for about half of the world still.
And not
Not talked about, yeah.
It's a great point. I want to kind of just amplify the second part of your question. Can we actually give Trump one, and I won't even say Trump, but let's say, can we give Bob Lighthizer, the former USTR, credit for pulling up the scrim on the U.S.-China imbalances? Is there anything else that we can say that Trump, perhaps not the man, but the administration did that we like?
I mean, I don't want to dominate, but I will say two things. I mean,
it's okay.
Just two things.
You have a PTSD, I'm sure, from all this.
No, I mean, I remember. I mean, right after he was inaugurated in his first press conference, and I was standing in my comms director's office, and we're watching him, and he went after Carrier, and I remember standing there, and I was like, wow, wow, so a president of the United States can stand at the podium and tell a firm that is shutting down and moving to Mexico that they shouldn't do it to save jobs. And I was like, where have you, like, seriously, you can do that? It was amazing.
Yeah.
Right? It was so powerful.
It's interesting, yeah.
To say that actually the federal government is very powerful. And we should be thinking about the relationship between the government and capital. Again, the way he went about things and the outcomes didn't really pan out, but the idea that our democratically elected leaders should have a say in economic outcomes.
Same with Walmart pricing.
I mean, and I think just as a listener, you're like, wow, so is that a decision we get to make? What decisions do we get to make? What don't we? I found that just as an economist, it was really insightful to me. And
So we have, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
no, and it's not, I'm not saying that's like the policy that you should do, but he has goals.
Well, he broke rules, too.
Yeah, but he's saying, here's the kind of economy that I want for my people.
Yeah.
Now, he's not going about it in a way that's going to deliver that.
Yeah.
But I am down with the idea that we should actually be thinking about what kind of society we want and what kind of economy we want, and that's the national conversations we should be having.
No, it's interesting because I think Trump's great genius is, I personally think he's a bit of a con man, but not a bit, definitely a con man, but, he can take a felt truth, which is there are a lot of people in nation states that feel that the global market system is not working in their interest, and then embed it in whatever crazy he wants to bring. But that is a felt truth, and saying that to companies, whether or not you enforce it, and then whether or not you're, doing all kinds of other things with deregulation.
And we said, hey, if you want our money for chips, you need to, as you pointed out, you need to build not you need to, but we want to encourage you to build a child care center. I mean, there's that accountability.
Yeah. No, I think that's it. Did you want to make a quick
you want to start
point?
Well, I mean, I guess I would disagree with all three of them. I cannot find any redeeming feature whatsoever, even when the stated objectives, because I think, as in the Walmart case or the carrier case, that this is just theater. And furthermore, that the way to go about this is not by picking on companies individually and berating them, in front of TV cameras. And that the way, because even if you agree with the objective, then you're just opening up yourself to all kinds of lawlessness and arbitrary treatment, and that's not what we should be standing for. And Lighthizer, I mean, I think I think he had it was a completely wrong diagnosis of the problem, and I think, unfortunately, many on the left made common cause with Lighthizer because it looked like, he was targeting the trade deficit, was targeting sort of the problem of manufacturing and so forth. But, I think it was just, this wasn't the right way to go about it. So, I disagree.
Good place. Good place. Question far over here, and then let's get a woman with it. Where is a woman with a question? There. Okay, you're going next.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Roger. I just wanted to ask, it sounds like a lot of this conversation prior, and in some extent including the Trump conversation, could have happened a year ago. But in the meantime, right, we had an administration that tried a lot of post-neoliberalism and got trounced. And I'm just wondering, obviously there are factors that were outside of the administration's control. Some of them had to do with the leader himself. Some of them had to do with inflation. But what I would love to hear from you all is, like, for the post-neoliberal movement, what are the lessons of electoral defeat? And we're not having this conversation a year ago. We did the thing. There were a lot of promises that this would not only be good policy, but good politics. And then we lost. I'm just wondering
so great question.
What lessons you all take from that?
I have ideas on this, but I'm going to let you all go first. Dani, why don't you give a...
Yeah, I mean, I think first let me admit that I would have expected the Biden administration to have done much better in the election. So I cannot claim that I mean, but from my perspective, I would say, I mean, obviously, I think, Biden's own, sort of cognitive decline, I think, played a significant role. I do think that the Democratic Party could not sufficiently replace the image of a party was mainly looking after people who weren't doing work and just distributing money. It was a very interesting poll just before the election that sort of asked Hispanic workers in Texas, what turns you off most from the Democratic Party? And it wasn't about the woke culture. It was mainly that they viewed Democratic Party as a party that sort of distributes money to people who are not working. And I think that's an important point there, because sort of like many immigrants who are sort of very hardworking, they say they're making a life for themselves in the United States, and there is this image of essentially a largely social welfarist and redistributive Democratic Party, which, by the way, I don't think is the correct description for all the reasons that Heather outlined in terms of what the Biden administration was really doing. But it's still, the polls reflect that image. Maybe just one possibility, 4 years is not enough. So, that it would be hard. And then the final thing I would say, I would go back to my argument that the nature of the working class is different. I do think that the policies of the Biden administration was largely targeting a working class that has disappeared. For reasons of resistance from Republicans, and that part of the agenda couldn't be implemented, or because the China phenomenon really overshadowed the agenda, and so much of the energy was spent on advanced semiconductors, which frankly was, in terms of good jobs, doesn't play a huge role. That I think some of the opportunities of connecting with the broader working class, which again, not to repeat, it's largely in services, I think that was missed.
Heather, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, so a few things. It's a great question. I've thought about it just a little bit.
Every night
for
the last 3 months.
So let me just list the things. I mean, so if you're going to make big structural shifts, having 2 years is not a lot of time. Right? I tracked very closely the data on, what we were doing, and you'd have announcements, and then a few months later, you started to see that showing up in data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. Our analysis is that you weren't going to see those jobs show up until, a couple years after that, which, gets us to this past winter, so after the election. So there's that. So in terms of a political outcome, I don't know that wasn't what people were saying when the IRA passed. Because, by the way, remember, nobody thought it was going to pass, right? And nobody knew what exactly it was going to be because of all of the shenanigans that happened. And it wasn't what passed the House almost a year before the IRA finally passed. So there's a disconnect in terms of the intentionality that people put on the political outcome and what actually happened. Remember that the legislation that passed the House, Build Back Better bill, had a lot of money for childcare, for home care, for health care, for housing supply. Do these sound familiar? Yes, because these were all kitchen table issues that could have, I think, done a lot to help us on the inflation conversation, right? The kinds of conversations that people are having over the kitchen table, none of that made it across the finish line because Joe Manchin thought that those would be inflationary, when in fact those actually would have helped to deal with the direct costs that families were facing and give more of that concrete benefit. Giving tax credits to businesses to invest in either clean energy or semiconductors or their community to do infrastructure. These are not things that are going to show up at people's kitchen tables, right? It's going to take a while. What they're going to notice is that there's a bridge being built, and so now there's a traffic jam because they have to drive around, so that's kind of annoying. And they're also maybe not thinking that Joe Biden brought them that. So length of time, a lot of the important things didn't make it into our agenda that I think would have really helped. The communications weren't great. And I've thought a lot about this one because I've talked to a lot of people who've asked me questions like, why weren't you people on the road? And I'm like, okay, so just in case that's a question you have, I saw the cabinet notes every week. Everybody was on the road. They could travel all the time. The president gave speeches on what we were doing multiple times a week. You just didn't hear about any of it. So I don't know what to do about that. We also spent a lot of time talking about signs. And looking back, it's like, to get the amount of money that you would have needed to do the ad campaign, I've been trying to, it's been a mental note to ask somebody what that would cost. I literally have no idea. What would an ad campaign have cost to really do that? We're talking tens of millions, right? Not like billions, but like, lots of millions of dollars. And even that, though, would have been hard to get in the agenda that passed because we were trying to be very, right? You could see that would have been looked at as a boondoggle. And nobody else stepped up to do a big national campaign in the way that you would have needed to do, right? And then here's the other thing. I spent the last year of the administration traveling to 19 states and meeting with people. And there were so many things that I heard time and time again, but one was you're seeing these things happen at the local level, making real change. But what media is telling the story about what is happening in Erie, Pennsylvania, right? And is that bubbling up to the national level? No. I read the national papers every day. Occasionally you got some bumps, but you didn't hear what was actually that transformative change. That's about the decimation of investigative journalism all across the country. That's not one thing. That's like a gazillion things where you don't have that local news hearing that story of that real change.
Yeah.
So you lost that connective tissue as well.
Media fragmentation was huge. Just as a statistic there, the top views for both candidates, Trump, it was the Joe Rogan podcast, and for Kamala, it was Call Her Daddy, which is another podcast, got 23 million views. That's more than the entire cable news primetime put together. So I think media fragmentation and the fragmentation of America in general is a huge story here. I also, can I just jump in and say, we're going to take the last question and get you guys.
Can I have a view
okay,
from the outside?
very quickly, and then
Yeah. Very quickly from the outside, from the outside, it seems like for large capital, it was all carrots, no sticks. And I think
all
that
carrots,
also
no sticks.
And I think that also played in people's
Incentives,
minds.
the fiscal.
Only fiscal incentives, no disciplining.
Yeah.
No disciplining at all. Further benefits, further bailouts, Syndicate Bank, Silicon Valley Bank, et cetera. So basically, large capital being given a completely free run when they are being blamed for a lot of the problems.
Okay, let's take the final question, and then we'll get you guys drinking.
Yeah, I know I'm ready for that part of the evening.
Is there one more mic up here? I just want to get one woman asking a question in this audience.
Thank you. I have a question for Jayati, and it's about the disproportionate access to the middle class in India. For the biometric payment system that you mentioned.
Sorry, can you hear it? No.
Not
You want to speak a little bit louder?
For the biometric payment systems in India, do you think that the issues with manual labour workers being able to receive their payments, to what extent may that be deliberate to exploit their labour, or is it just a misfortunate mishap in the new bond payment system?
Okay, so I'm not a fan of this government, so I would say it's deliberate because they then claim efficiency, right? They're saying, we're able to deliver with less. We've weeded out all the criminals who were falsely claiming benefits or claiming that they had worked for the wages and so on. So, but it is well known that especially for manual workers, about 20% of the time your biometrics will not match. And it's not something they didn't know.
Okay, I have about 1,000 more questions, but we are going to go have dinner, and then you can rush the panelists and ask all the things that you didn't ask. But I want to give you guys a major congrats, thank you, and thanks to Gary for organizing.